She stood there smiling like she had already won, so I made sure she watched me give the pearls to someone else. The room went silent the moment the velvet box clicked open in my hands, every eye fixed on me, every breath held just a second too long, and across the polished dining table Emily's smile froze, not completely gone yet, but cracking just enough for me to see what had been hiding underneath it all along: expectation, entitlement, certainty, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times and every version ended the same way, with those pearls resting in her hands with her victory quietly acknowledged by everyone in the room, with me stepping aside like I was supposed to, like I was just another piece of furniture in a house she had already decided belonged to her. And maybe that was my fault for letting things go on as long as they did, for choosing silence over confrontation, for believing that respect would come with time instead of understanding that sometimes silence only invites more taking, more assuming, more quiet little claims that grow into something far bigger before you even notice what is happening, because Emily had not always been so obvious about it. Not in the beginning, back when she first walked into our lives with that warm, careful smile and that soft voice that made everyone feel at ease. Back when my son Daniel could not stop talking about how thoughtful she was, how organized, how driven, how she made him feel like everything in his life was finally coming together. And I remember watching her that first Thanksgiving, standing in my kitchen offering to help, asking where everything went, complimenting the way I ran the house as if she genuinely admired it. And I thought maybe this was exactly what our family needed. Someone who would fit in without trying to take over. Someone who understood that traditions are not just things you inherit, they are things you earn slowly, carefully over time. But small things started to shift, almost too quietly to notice at first, like the way she would correct Daniel in front of others, not harshly, just enough to show she knew better, or the way she would casually mention how certain traditions felt outdated, always smiling, always polite, but always planting something underneath her words, something that suggested change, something that suggested improvement, something that quietly asked why things had to stay the way they were. And I told myself it was normal, that every new person brings a different perspective, that families evolve. But then there were moments that did not feel like evolution, moments that felt like replacement, like the time she reorganized my pantry without asking while I was out running errands, or the way she started hosting gatherings at her place instead of ours, slowly shifting the center of gravity away from me, away from what I had built over decades. And still I said nothing, because I did not want to be the difficult one. I did not want to be the mother-in-law everyone whispers about, so I let it happen piece by piece, until the day she first mentioned the pearls. And even then it was subtle, almost disguised as admiration. She had picked them up during a family dinner, turning them gently in her fingers, asking where they came from, and I told her the truth, that they belonged to my grandmother, that they were passed down through generations, that they were not just jewelry but a story, a memory, something that carried meaning beyond its shine. And she nodded, smiling, but there was something in her eyes I could not quite place at the time, something that lingered just a second too long. And that should have been my first warning, because what starts as admiration can easily turn into expectation when someone believes they deserve what you have. And by the time she finally said it out loud, by the time she stood in my living room and told me she wanted those pearls, not asked, not hoped, but wanted, as if it was already decided, I realized I had let the line blur far too much. And what she saw as confidence was really just the result of every moment I chose not to speak, every time I allowed her to take one step further than she should have. And standing there now, with that velvet box in my hands and the weight of every unspoken moment behind me, I understood that this was not just about pearls anymore. This was about something far more important, something that had been building quietly for a long time, and I was finally ready to answer it in a way she would never forget. What surprised me was not that Emily wanted the pearls, it was how calmly she said it, like she was discussing something as ordinary as borrowing a sweater, standing there with her arms lightly crossed and that same polite smile resting on her face, as if she expected me to simply nod and hand them over without hesitation. And for a moment I just looked at her, trying to understand how we had gotten to this exact point, how something so personal, something that had never even been part of any conversation about inheritance or gifts, had suddenly become a request she felt comfortable making out loud. And when I did not respond immediately, she tilted her head slightly and added that it only made sense, that she was the one carrying on the family now, that these things should move forward with the next generation. Her voice still soft, but her words carrying a quiet certainty that left very little room for disagreement. And I remember glancing at Daniel, hoping for some kind of reaction, some small acknowledgement that this was not appropriate, but he only shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact, caught somewhere between discomfort and unwillingness to step in. And that was the moment I realized this was not just Emily's confidence, it was something that had been allowed to grow, something that had been reinforced by silence and by the absence of boundaries, because Emily did not push, she simply stepped forward into spaces that no one actively protected. And over time those spaces became hers without anyone ever officially giving them away, and she continued, explaining how she had always admired the pearls, how they would suit her perfectly for upcoming events, how it would mean so much to her to wear something with history, and every word sounded reasonable on the surface, carefully chosen, almost persuasive, but underneath it all there was that same underlying assumption, that the decision had already been made, and she was simply informing me of it. And I could feel something shift inside me as she spoke, not anger, not yet, but a clarity that had been missing before, a realization that this was the result of every moment I had chosen to keep the peace instead of drawing a line. And I asked her calmly, what made her think the pearls were something to be requested in the first place? And for the first time her smile flickered just slightly, not disappearing but tightening, as if she had not expected resistance, and she laughed softly, brushing it off, saying she thought it was obvious that as Daniel's wife she was part of the family, that these traditions naturally passed to her. And that was when the room seemed to grow quieter, not because anyone had said anything, but because everyone was listening more carefully now, waiting to see how I would respond, and I could feel the weight of their attention, the unspoken expectation that I would either give in or create a moment no one could ignore. And instead of answering her directly, I simply closed the conversation, telling her that the pearls were not something I would be discussing that day, keeping my tone steady, leaving no space for negotiation, and she paused, clearly surprised by the lack of agreement. But then she smiled again, that same composed expression returning, as if she believed this was only a temporary delay, as if she had already decided that persistence would eventually lead to the outcome she wanted, and the conversation moved on. But the air in the room had changed. Something unspoken settling between us, something that could not be undone by polite small talk or careful smiles. And over the next few days I watched her more closely, noticing the way she mentioned the pearls in passing, the way she casually brought them up in conversations with others, planting the idea as if it was already becoming accepted. And that was when I understood that this was no longer just a request, it was a quiet campaign, a slow shaping of perception, and I knew that if I allowed it to continue, if I stayed silent again, the outcome would eventually be taken out of my hands. And standing there in that moment days later with the velvet box in front of me, I was not reacting to a single conversation, I was responding to everything that had led up to it, every assumption, every overstep, every quiet moment where I had chosen not to speak, because this time I was not going to let silence decide anything for me. Over the next few days I began to notice patterns that I had ignored before, small details that now felt impossible to overlook, like the way Emily would casually bring up the pearls in conversations that had nothing to do with family heirlooms, mentioning them while discussing upcoming events or gatherings, always in a tone that suggested familiarity, as if she already had some connection to them beyond simply admiring them. And each time she did it I watched the reactions around her, the subtle nods, the polite smiles, the quiet acceptance that slowly started to form, as if repetition alone could turn an assumption into reality. And I realized that she was not asking anymore, she was establishing a narrative, one where the pearls naturally belonged to her, one where anyone who heard her speak about them enough times would begin to see it that way too. And what unsettled me the most was not her persistence, it was how effective it was becoming, because people tend to accept what they hear often enough, especially when it is presented with confidence and without opposition. And I understood then that silence was not neutral, it was permission, and I had been giving it far too freely. And so instead of confronting her directly I chose to observe, to understand exactly how far she intended to take this. And that was when I started noticing how she treated Sophie, my assistant, who had been working with me for nearly 8 years, someone who knew my schedule better than I did, who anticipated problems before they appeared, who had quietly supported not just my work but my personal life in ways that went far beyond her job description. And yet Emily treated her as if she barely existed, offering polite acknowledgments at best, dismissive glances at worst, as though Sophie was simply part of the background, someone who did not need to be considered or respected. And there was one moment in particular that stayed with me, a small interaction that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been paying attention, where Sophie had carefully prepared documents for an event we were hosting, placing them neatly on the table with everything organized down to the smallest detail. and Emily walked in, glanced at them briefly, and then moved them aside without a word, replacing them with her own version, not even checking if there was a reason things had been arranged the way they were. And Sophie did not say anything, she simply adjusted quietly as she always did. But I saw the flicker in her expression, that brief moment of being overlooked, of being dismissed, and it struck me that respect is often revealed in how people treat those they believe have no power over them. And in that moment I saw a contrast so clear it was almost impossible to ignore. On one side someone who assumed ownership over things that were not hers, and on the other someone who never asked for anything but consistently gave more than expected. And that contrast stayed with me, growing sharper with each passing day, until it became the center of my thinking, not just about the pearls but about everything they represented, because they were never just an object to be handed over. They were a symbol of continuity, of values passed down through generations, of understanding what it means to belong to something larger than yourself, and belonging is not claimed, it is demonstrated over time through actions, through respect, through consistency. And I began to see that the decision I needed to make was not about responding to a single demand, it was about defining what those values actually meant in the present, and whether I was willing to stand by them even when it created discomfort. And as the day of our next family gathering approached, the one where everyone would be together again, I could feel the anticipation building not just within myself but in the way Emily carried herself, a quiet confidence that suggested she believed the outcome was already decided, that this was simply a matter of time. And I let her believe that. I allowed the expectation to grow because sometimes the most powerful response is not immediate, it is deliberate, carefully timed, and impossible to misunderstand when it finally arrives. And as I stood there preparing for that evening, the velvet box resting in my hands once again, I knew that whatever happened next would not just settle a question about a piece of jewelry, it would draw a line that could not be erased, a line that would make it clear exactly what mattered and exactly who understood it. The evening of the gathering arrived with a kind of quiet tension that no one acknowledged out loud but everyone seemed to feel, the house filled with familiar voices, the soft clinking of glasses, the steady rhythm of polite conversation, and yet beneath it all there was something sharper, something waiting, and I could see it most clearly in Emily, in the way she moved through the room with a confidence that felt slightly too deliberate, greeting people with warmth but always steering conversations in subtle directions, always bringing attention back to herself, to her place in the family, to the idea that she was already settled into a role that had not been given to her. And every now and then her eyes would drift toward me, not in confrontation but in quiet expectation, as if she was simply waiting for the moment when everything would unfold the way she had already imagined it would. And I let the evening continue. I welcomed guests. I made sure everything was running smoothly. I spoke with relatives who had traveled from out of town, all while keeping my awareness fixed on the undercurrent that only I seemed to fully recognize, because this was not just a dinner, it had become a stage, whether anyone admitted it or not. And as the night progressed the conversations naturally gathered around the dining table, plates were cleared, desserts were brought out, and that was when Emily gently guided the moment exactly where she wanted it to go, mentioning traditions again, speaking about how important it was to carry them forward, her tone thoughtful, almost reflective, but there was a precision in her timing that made it clear this was not spontaneous. And then she turned slightly toward me, not directly but enough that everyone could feel the shift, and she said that some things in life were meant to be passed down, that it was how families stayed connected across generations. And there was a pause, a small but deliberate pause, and I could feel every person at that table become more attentive, even if they did not fully understand why. And I met her gaze calmly, giving nothing away, because I knew that this was the moment she had been preparing for, not just tonight but for days, perhaps even longer. And she smiled, that same composed expression, and finally spoke more directly, saying that she had been thinking a lot about the pearls, about their history, about how meaningful it would be to continue that legacy. And the way she said it made it sound less like a request and more like a conclusion, something already decided, something already accepted. And there was a quiet murmur around the table, subtle reactions, curiosity, anticipation, and I noticed Daniel shift again, his discomfort more visible now, but still not enough to interrupt, still not enough to challenge what was unfolding. And I realized that if I did not take control of this moment now, it would continue to slip further away from me, shaped by assumptions instead of intention. And so I let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough for everyone to feel it, long enough for Emily to believe that I was about to confirm what she wanted. And then I stood up slowly, my movements calm, deliberate, reaching for the small velvet box that I had placed nearby earlier in the evening, and the room seemed to tighten around that single action, conversations fading, attention sharpening, because even without words everyone understood that something significant was about to happen, and I could feel Emily's certainty solidify, her posture straightening slightly, her expression brightening just enough to reveal the expectation she had been holding on to, and I walked toward the center of the table, holding the box carefully, not rushing, not hesitating, simply allowing the moment to build on its own, because sometimes the most powerful statements are not made quickly, they are allowed to unfold in full view, with no room for misunderstanding. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, I knew that what I was about to do would not just answer her. It would redefine the entire situation in a way that could not be ignored, a way that would make it impossible for anyone to pretend they had not seen it happen. And in that moment, before I even opened the box, I could already sense the shift beginning, the quiet realization that this was not going to follow the path Emily had so confidently imagined. The sound of the clasp releasing was softer than I expected, but in that quiet room it carried with it a kind of finality that seemed to settle over everyone at once, and as I lifted the lid of the velvet box I did not look at Emily, not yet, because I knew exactly